hopefully you can see slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Morning, everybody. My name is Gemma Hyde. I work for the Town and Country Planning Association. It's already been mentioned. Got a long-standing relationship with Sport England around creating healthier, more active places. And I'm a project and policy officer, sort of focused on healthier placemaking with the TCPA. I'm sure we'll share slides, so you get my email address out of this at the end, if that's of any interest to people. There we go. Very quickly, the Town and Country Planning Association, we're actually a charity. We've been around for a long time, came out of the Garden City movement. So if anyone's interested in garden cities and new places, lots to say on that. But basically we have this vision that we want places where everybody can thrive, and that means creating places for people as well as planet, and we work towards our vision through sort of trying to challenge, to inspire, to pull together ideas and people who are working towards the same goal, and we do research, we try to influence policy at all levels, and we provide a lot of training and guidance. There's loads of stuff on our website, lots of there's a whole library of materials that you're welcome to check out. And we also publish various newsletters. And I know that Simon finds one of them useful. So he was suggesting that the TCPA monthly newsletter might be something that you want to subscribe to. And there's a link for that on that slide. So I like language. So the first thing I did sort of thinking about this was just to look up regeneration and regenerate. And I found it really interesting that immediately we came across ideas around making places more active when you regenerate them, changing things radically and for the better, and also about revival and vigorous life. And I just thought that that was sort of fantastic in a way, that it really sets the scene about what we're trying to talk about today. So I am not an expert in regeneration. I'm going to add a big caveat to this presentation. But what I can do is sort of give you a broad overview in terms of how the TCPA might think about it, and some of the ways that active partnerships might wish to think about this if it's going on in your area. So who are the actors? Well, obviously it's going to be local authorities, and that might be at varying levels and scales. You've got town and parish councils who might get involved. You've got business improvement districts, housing providers, developers, and communities and community groups. And some of the presentations that you're going to hear in a moment will sort of deep dive into some of those. But it's quite a varied group. And even within, say, local authorities, it's going to involve lots of different departments and cross-discipline working. So it's quite a complex picture in a lot of ways. And that's going to be a slight theme to this sort of presentation. And the other thing that we have to think about in the context of all of this is the fact that last week we had the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. And we've certainly spent the last week looking at it, going, oh, that sounds good, scratching our heads about other bits and trying to sort of understand sort of the direction of travel that the government are hoping to take. So increasingly, we're really going to see a shift in language towards levelling up and towards systems change, which I know is something that as active partnerships you are very comfortable with. And in some ways, that's absolutely brilliant. I think you're ahead of the game, sort of in your ways of thinking around how to create active environments and influence what's going on. There's a lot around economic growth and thriving high streets, and that's a focus that the government have obviously got going on. There's less of a focus, I would say, unfortunately, around health, but there are ways that we can weave it in where it's not explicit. And really what the government are interested in, they've got these 4 objectives over 12 missions, and I'll show you those in a second. But some of this is just about being aware that this is on the table. It's obviously very new, and probably also to flag that nothing's going to happen very quickly. So there's a whole round of consultations that are going to happen on various parts of this bill. If things go smoothly, it may well sort of come into law in spring 2024. But a big part of that will then be transition arrangements from the old to the new sort of systems. And also there will be a period where local authorities have a chance to sort of create new local plans and things like that. So we probably won't see any firm policy coming out of this bill until maybe 2026. So don't get too excited. So these are the 4 objectives and then the 12 missions. So there is obviously a health mission in here, but it's very specific. And I think what the active environments work is going to be about is actually looking at all of these and weaving in your key messages and trying to sort of, where it makes sense and where it's authentic, to use the language involved in levelling up to sort of sell what you do, in a sense. So regeneration of what? So we talk about regeneration and we often immediately go to the physical environment. So built environment, how places are laid out, regeneration of substandard housing, so maybe post-war tower blocks, sites that include housing that's just not fit for modern living anymore, and certainly in an energy crisis, sort of dealing with some of that, as well as climate change issues. It might be building uses, it might be about the public realm, but we also really need to keep an eye on this sort of social environment and the regeneration of that, because we know they go hand in hand. So always with an eye on reducing inequalities, and it's about community and cultural and employment opportunities, and making sure that they are sort of front and centre of work that's going on, and then health and well-being, and also reducing crime and fear of crime. So what are the opportunities? I think what a regeneration programme, wherever it's coming from, does provide is a moment to sort of re-look at vision. So what do you want from a place? And it's a moment for ambitious vision. So you know, places may decide to pick a lens to do that through. So it could be a net zero lens, it could be a 20-minute neighbourhood lens, or it could be something focused on something like green infrastructure. But it's a chance to sort of set out again, preferably in consultation, we would hope, what people want from a place, and how that place is going to develop over the long term. And quite often it's about incremental improvements. It's not that you're going to wave a wand, level somewhere and rebuild it brand spanking new. It's often about making small changes towards your ambitious vision. And you can sort of start to tie in lots of things around identity of place. There can be opportunities for co-production, targeted interventions that really sort of focus on those inequalities that might exist in an area, and using economic development to drive improvements in health and wellbeing outcomes. And that's where that sort of active environments part really comes in. We know that if we can get everybody more active every day and reduce levels of inactivity, we're going to drive improvements at a population level over health and wellbeing. The challenges. So the challenges are that it's often that projects are defined geographically around places, and that doesn't always make sense from a lived experience point of view. So it can be a challenge to make sure that things join up wider than your regeneration area. So we always need one eye on, actually, we've got this space that we're going to do something with, but then how does that impact on the spaces next door? And how can people move through and connect? And if we've got high levels of inequality next door, is it going to make them better or worse? So these are the things that we need to sort of think about. Getting engagement of voices to shape places is a challenge. There are lots of people doing really good work around this, but you know, it takes time and effort and relationships. So that has to be sort of built into the process. There's also sometimes issues around the funding. So regeneration attracts often national level funding, but the funding can be short term, it can be ring fenced, and it can include perverse conditions. And by that, I mean that recently we've seen some funding pots that have included asks. So the funding is conditional upon reducing car travel times from one place to another, and which most people to that go, well, let's make road improvements, or sort of think about traffic. And that's not something that we would necessarily want to focus on. We would want to sort of focus on how do we actually improve connectivity by other modes. And it can be fragmented as well. It can face challenges over land and asset ownership, and you have to sort of build consensus across a broad spectrum of actors in the space. And there are questions over stewardship. So long term, if we create this wonderful new public space or new green infrastructure, how is that going to be managed in the long term and to whose benefit? And equally issues over gentrification. So if we sort of go and make somewhere really nice by pouring regeneration money into it, what does that do to the people who live there? Is it going to put up land values and house prices and rental fees? So we have to really think about what we're doing and not cause issues around gentrification, and that's tricky. The way our system works means that that's quite difficult. So just to sort of think about key things that active partnerships might want to do in this space at quite a high level. I think the top one is really to just keep advocating for active environments as much as possible. And ideally, we want to sort of get that in as a council priority. So it's that political piece. And we're not always comfortable with the political piece, but it is really important that the council has a strong top level strategic objective that they want their citizens, their population to thrive and be able to be active. And if it's set up at the beginning, it is far more likely than to flow through into the decisions and the strategies and the policies that come from that, because you can always point back to it and say, we should be working towards this. Part of that might be actually if your council has declared a climate emergency, it's a really great way to think about active travel in particular, and make sure that it gets in as a top priority. And then I would suggest that you just find out about your council. So some of you are probably very well embedded, but others, you might need to do a bit of digging. So some places are setting up levelling up boards to try and coordinate bids for funding. Get to know your business improvement district if you have one, and be really clear about who you are and what your priorities are. And because you can offer something unique in terms of local evidence, local information, and that, so you can sort of provide that local stakeholder feedback into a bid that is going to support any bid that sort of fits your priorities. And also, where there are consultations, you can get involved and put in answers to those. And they'll be advertised on council websites. Keep an eye on your local democracy reporting in your local newspapers, and just take the opportunities when they arise to sort of make your points and point out that active travel is, active environments are good for everybody. And that, hey, I'll stop. So, bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I don't know if there are any questions you want to answer now, or if you want to plough on.
I think, Gemma, thank you ever so much. Excellent. So great start in terms of, I think, what we define and mean by regeneration. So I think if people have got questions, let's put those in the chat, and Simon and I and Gemma will go through this. Unless anybody's got something burning now that you just want to put your hand up with. I'll take that as a no. So give that some thought, and let's put some things in the chat if you've got questions. Can we? What we'll do now? Let's move on. Just conscious of time. Can I introduce Paul Clement, who's the CEO of Locus Management? Paul, I'm not going to steal your thunder, but there's clearly been a lot of excellent work done in Ipswich around this regeneration agenda. So just at this stage, can I hand over to you?
You certainly can, and I have to say, I'm not entirely sure I can add that much in the next 20 minutes to that Gemma has already said. I thought that was an excellent overview of where Regeneration sits at. Ipswich is my hometown. It's very important to me. I'm very passionate about it. I love the town. I love the county. It's my place, and that's how people feel about their town and city centres. It's their DNA is formed through the place in which they live. They grow up, they get educated, they bring their family up, and so on. So for me, this is an aerial view of my hometown in Ipswich. The strategy for Ipswich sits around a 15-minute town centre, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. And I have been involved with the TCPA's 20-minute community and evolving that piece of policy work. Regeneration of town and city centres is a really awkward process. You never ever please all the people all of the time. Regeneration is about density, it's about proximity, it's about a degree of awkwardness, it's about a juxtaposition. Some things don't sit necessarily where you think they will be, and that whole process requires an awkward set of decision making. We need to remember that this regeneration thing we're talking about now, this isn't easy, this is hard to do. I'll give you a quick overview in terms of levelling up. You know, if you think back since urban policy became something in the UK, so you're talking about the 1960s, pre the oil crisis, days of very high inflation, days of cost of living crisis. Do you remember those things that were a thing of the past until now? 1960s is where urban policy in the UK was born. And think what's happened since then. You know, you've got the Thatcher era where it was about making the landscape easy for the private sector to come in and invest. She set up development corporations and so on, which took a degree of control away from local authorities, gave it with a body locally made, primarily made up of business people, and made the process of regeneration easy. Less about the outcome, much more about the process. You know, go to Tony Blair's policies, which were actually really just a continuation of Thatcher's policies, if we're honest with ourselves, but with a touch of renaissance sitting around them, and quality and design and quality and output, but also coupled with making sure places were safe, but were stunning in terms of their form. Move again to Cameron's era. Cameron was all about give localism the control, give local people, local bodies, local coalitions, local partnerships, local business improvement districts or whatever, give them the control. And now suddenly you've got levelling up from the Johnson administration. Is levelling up the silver bullet that places need? No, I don't think it is. It is just another period of experimentation in urban regeneration. But what that passage of time shows you is the default is always in the end back to the local. It's about how local people view their place, what they want it to be, how they want that outcome to be derived. And really that what sits at the very heart of the government's levelling up policy is the essence of local leadership. So if we just go forward on this, sorry, there we go. Right, so this is how, if I came to your place and I was working with you to create what you want that place to be in the future, a vision. So a vision is not a short-term redevelopment. It's not a sort of tactical approach. It's not a site-specific approach. It's what do you want this place overall to mean in the future? And you're talking about periods of 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and so on years. I try and get you to focus on 3 areas. The first is the historic. So why does your place exist in the first place? Why is it there? How has it evolved? And what are its historical landmarks? And do they feature in the place as I see it now? So for my hometown, in the 1950s, 1960s, the town centre turned its back on the port because it was an industrial trading port. And yet the very reason Ipswich was there was because it was a port side. It was a waterfront town. So the strategy in Ipswich is about reconnecting the town centre with the waterfront. But the historic reason for Ipswich being here was fundamental to that. Secondly, the physical side. So how does your place actually operate? How does it function? How do I get around it? How do I drive through it? Do you want me to drive through it? How do I walk through it? How do I cycle through it? Are those routeways clear? Are they safe? Are they easy to use? And where are those disconnects where if I'm a visitor to your place, or I'm going to be in your place to study or whatever, you want me to go certain ways and see certain things physically? Have you structured this place so that that is made easy for me? Number two. And then the really important third bit is, how do people feel about it? And when you ask local people what they feel about their place, inherently they are positive and they want to feel positive about the future, but actually they will start to articulate to you the ways in which they want to be able to describe the place in the future. And when you put those three things together, why am I there? How does it work? What do people want to feel? You kind of end up with that. This is the journey I need to take. I can now visualize that end point that I want to be at. So that's how I would do visioning. But do you know what? Nobody can claim this is new. So on the left-hand side, you've got, I don't think it was actually necessarily painted at the time, but this is the Greek agora. So go to towns as they were first formed. They were always formed around a central space. And the central space was intensively used, and the physical form of the place built around that central space. So think of it in today's terms on the right-hand side, you know, your market square, your town square, most of our places have that central space. If you said to 100 people, I will meet you in the center of, 99 would be standing in that space that I'm talking about. But if you go back to when those spaces were first formed, they were the functioning heart of town and city centres. They weren't used for infrequent events. They were used intensively every day. It's where politics was done. It's where people traded. It's where people went to see the medic. They lived around it. They socialised around it. It was part of their everyday function. And that's really where town and city centres have lost their way. They have become far more about a transaction. I go into town to buy something, and much less about that social side. There are some lessons we learn, I think, from COVID as to how it is and could be still important, but we've rather lost our way on that. And if you bring yourself to more recent times, again, nothing that is going on in town and city centres now is new. Aspects of it have all been done in the past. So don't look at the levelling up documents and think this is fresh. It's not fresh. It's another period of experimentation. Bits of it will work, bits of it probably won't work. Bits of it at the outset are daft. Some bits of it, yeah, I can see them maybe working. Go back to the 1920s in New York. New York suddenly became a congested place because everybody wanted a motor car and everybody wanted to drive through a city that had not been constructed for that vehicular experience. So Clarence Perry came up with this idea of neighbourhood living. And neighbourhoods around New York were always built around a school, because that meant it was family living, and it meant around a school you needed certain things that would keep you in your neighbourhood and stop you driving through the city to get from one side to another. You'd work there, you'd go to the doctors there, your children would play there, they would be educated there, etc., etc. You do your shopping there. You wouldn't necessarily need to use the heart of the city. Go to the 1960s, 1970s in New York, very famously, and there's a very good play in London about this if you ever get the chance to see it, but Jane Jacobs standing up against Moses, whose job it was to demolish parts of New York and regenerate them with private money. And what she was saying was, no, 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 no. I will lose the experience of my place that matters to me. I'll lose the ability to walk and socialize if you do this. And there was this battle between, this very famous battle between the two. And then go to the present day, Carlos Marino, who has claimed that he has come up with this idea of the 15-minute city. He hasn't really, as I've shown you, but he has said, forget the center of Paris. What we need now is neighborhood living around the side, and we need to stop people traversing through the city. We need to give them everything they need to live their lives locally in their neighborhoods and make that degree of living something that they want to do, but then they experience the city on a more infrequent basis. And none of this is particularly new. And I have had a look at Sport England's, oh, hang on, what's going on there? There we go. I have had a look at Sport England's strategic outcomes and planning policies. And, you know, I'm pleased to say they talk a lot about place. and the experience of place and creating long-term ambition. So again, there's nothing in this that places shouldn't want to embrace. So let's go to where we are today. Is what's going on in town and city centres today a crisis? Well, I think when you look up the definition of crisis, it absolutely does meet it. But let's reflect on why we're in this crisis. So this is a typical town or city centre with some decent brands you can see at ground floor level that you may want to go in and transact with. But look at those buildings. Those buildings weren't built as shops. And the vast majority of the upper floors here are now vacant. And these retailers are only trading on the ground floor. So in Ipswich, my hometown, our vacancy rate, the number of shop frontages that are vacant, is 13%. Well, that's about the national average. I've calculated that 50% of the floor space is either unused or underused. And that's because our investment market encourages a landlord to attract a tenant whose covenant has been such, and they will pay whatever rent is necessary to occupy the most valuable piece of real estate in that building, which is the first 20 feet inside the shop front. Beyond that, nothing else really matters. And the landlord wants an easy life and only wants one tenant, irrespective of whether they're not going to use the upper floors. So if you look along here in this building, you can see Fatface here. Fatface only use that ground floor. But look, it's rather splendid above it. It's got 3 floors of unused space, which you can't even get to. So this is the issue with that has occurred. And then what you've had, and particularly during COVID, is 2 things. The first thing is the retailer has found it hard to make bricks and mortar stack up. And we can get into discussions around business rates and so on. But then the flip side is we, the consumer, have changed our habits. So we have got used to not going into Fatface to buy a product. We've got used to going on their website and having it delivered to our home. So the customer has moved away from bricks and mortar, which has made the job of trading in bricks and mortar ever harder. Now, that is not going to restore itself. The idea that the market will rectify this as it has done over decades before, that's not going to happen. The solution here is not more retail. It is different kinds of uses. But what is unusual about the current period is this ever flip-flopping idea between centralisation and decentralisation. So those of you that are old enough might remember 1960s America, 1970s, 1980s UK. Everybody wanted to live outside the centre. They wanted to live in suburbia. Suburbia was where people like you lived, and they lived in houses that were like the one that you were going to buy. And we all had the same size lawn with a picket fence around it, and we all mowed our lawn on a Sunday, and it was almost like living in Disneyland. Suburbia was the place to be. So what then happens is businesses follow people, and if people move out, then businesses move out, and you have this hollowing out effect. Centralisation is the reverse, where businesses move in, and in the 1980s, 1990s in the UK, that was why big in-town shopping centres started to be built, because if businesses want to move into glitzy shopping centres, then people want to move in as well. And you've got this odd period at the moment where businesses find it more viable to occupy either online transactional platforms or out of town transactional platforms. But yet people, even with COVID, the trend is that people still want to live centrally. So if you put those 2 things together, people want to live centrally and businesses by the whole, retail don't want to be there as much. You've got to find different uses that encourage more people to be there. You've got to build more different forms of housing. But when people are living in a space, they need those things that Marino is trying to put into Paris, which is doctors, dentists, vets, education, places to play, places to walk, places to cycle, open spaces, green spaces. The things that have been stripped out from town centres over the last few decades to bring retailers in to pay more money have got to be refound. There's a nice example of this actually in Nottingham, where the Broadmarsh Centre, the demolition of the Broadmarsh Centre, which was built in the 1960s, 1970s, and there were huge public protests against it because it took out big open spaces in the town and in the city centre, is now being demolished because there's too much retail in Nottingham. But actually the building, part of the building is going to be retained in order to provide party walls for big open green spaces and public spaces. It's quite an interesting story in that. And then what we need to remember on this call, forgive me, it's probably not all of you, but it is most of us, is that this regeneration is not for us. It's for a younger generation that live their lives in an entirely different way. You know, here's a group of people that are probably talking to each other through their phone. They are 24/7 communicating with their network. Their network is a very broad network. Their friends are global. And so most of those friends they've never ever met. Their friends on Facebook they've never met. And yet that is the chamber in which they communicate and they socialize. And they want to gather together in different ways. And they don't see our town and city centres as being places to buy stuff. Because there's nothing, virtually nothing, your town and city centre can sell them that they can't purchase and get delivered far more easily using that thing that's in their hands, their mobile phone. So we need to find ways in which our town and city centres appeal to this next generation and the generations that follow, pick up on the technology that is part of their everyday and allow them to socialise but not necessarily transact. And that's a very awkward model because economically it's difficult to make that work, but nonetheless that's where we're going to be. Because if we don't do that, then this group of people will simply go and sit and socialise somewhere else. So we need to be very aware that we have to do this. And if you ask this generation what they want of their town or city centre, this is the kind of language that they start to use. I want it to be livable, environmentally friendly. I want it to be differentiated. I want it to be filled with visitors. I want it to be 24/7. If the shop closes at 5 o'clock and I want to shop at 7 o'clock, that is not the shop for me. I need it to be compact. I want to be able to get around it easily. I want to feel proud of it and look on the far left-hand side. I just don't need as much retail. We need to be honest. Retail is not the future for our town and city centres. So here is my hometown of Ipswich, and there are three major landmarks in Ipswich. The first is the park, Christchurch Park, in the north of the town, one of the biggest open green spaces outside London. Bottom right-hand corner, the port, now regenerated as a marina and as a waterfront, which has got bars, restaurants, our university, our education quarter. We still build boats down there. It is a trading port, but people actually visit our town again because they come to it by boat. And then the left-hand side, we want more people to arrive to our town by rail and other means and less by car. And if you connect those three, you can walk to and from them within 15 minutes. So imagine that is now the proposition to those young people saying, when you first acquire your home, be it a flat or a house, live in that 15-minute zone. And when you need to move up through the housing ladder, let's make sure we can provide you with a house and it doesn't have to be an apartment. Then you start to build a proposition that says, these are the things that you need to provide in this neighbourhood. We're thinking of our town centre here as a community and as a neighbourhood. We're not thinking of it as a trading environment. So go back through history, and Ipswich's most famous son is Thomas Wolsey. He was born in Ipswich. He was born 5 minutes away from where I'm talking to you now. He is part of the reason why Ipswich is here, and part of the reason is also that it is a port. He built the largest college in Ipswich, which was demolished by Cromwell, and it was due to be the feeder school into Eton, so that Oxford and Ipswich would be the two feeder schools and people would come to Ipswich for education. He tells a great story because he was the son of a butcher and rose to become the most powerful man in England other than the king. So we are going to regenerate a major part of Ipswich around his story, and that regeneration process will then start to tell stories to young people who aspire to do better, and through the Wolsey story we'll find a way in which they can do that. The second thing is we're going to spend sums of money on streets and open spaces, and we're going to start to bring those to life. So this is a street that leads into our town square. It's a street really where retailers and businesses have rather turned their back on it, but actually you can see how it can function 24/7, and all of the upper floors in this street could potentially be residential. The building on the far right-hand corner, the modern building that's got the windows that then poke out, like most other town cities, that is a former Debenhams store, built for Debenhams, occupied by Debenhams for years, but that will now be repurposed with a frontage to the street. Will start to bring this street to life. And then we need to understand that in order for people to have moments, they need Instagram moments in spaces. So we have to think about what is the view that we want this audience, this young audience, to send to the world about our place. And we need to make it easy for that audience to start to send that message via their forms of social contact they have with their networks. So let's find great experiences that people can have in specific areas of the place that then start to tell a new story about it. So in terms of future cities, this would be my tips. Number one, forget that people may historically have needed to come here to buy stuff, and start to think about, how do I incentivize people to want to be there? The second is to build your regeneration around livability and sustainability. The third thing is to embrace urbanism. Town and city centres work, they really matter, and we shouldn't be turning our back on them. And it isn't just for those that live in the urban centre, it's for those that use it, and it forms part of their characteristic. You're going to have to be brave, and you're going to have to be radical, and along the way you're going to have to upset some people. If you try and do this by getting everybody on board with every aspect, then in the end you're going to water down the end proposition. You've got to be in it for the long term. The government's levelling up agenda will last for a period of time. It's a period of experimentation. You've got to think well beyond this policy suite at this moment in time, and you've got to make sure that your places are digitally enabled. What you've got to make sure that you aren't is, you must be brave, you must try stuff, and you must accept that some stuff won't work. That's fine. That comes with regeneration. Some bits work, some bits don't. Don't not do stuff because you're scared it won't work. And the second thing is, you've got to find what Gemma was talking about, that inclusive partnership coalition, that governance arrangement that goes beyond just business and the local council, and creates that overview of what your strategy is going to look like. So I think bang on time, I am finished. I'm very happy to answer any questions or respond to any suggestions, or alternatively, make you 5 minutes early for your cup of coffee, whichever you choose.
Paul, thank you ever so much. I think in reality, there's enough material there to occupy us for a day if we really wanted to explore it. I won't hold the light because people may well have questions, but certainly from my perspective and an active partnership perspective, I think what that's provided is a really useful framework and narrative to go to not just local authorities, but those other stakeholders, a kind of reason to come to the table. Because I will say, even in my patch, I'm not convinced that people are taking that thought and that approach. So I think that's a framework, and those key messages for strategic organisations like active partnerships are absolutely crucial. I think we need to think about that and document that and make that part of our ongoing narrative piece. And the only thing I would also say, I think that approach in principle applies not just to cities, but you can bring that down to almost market town level as well, because the rationale and the circumstances are quite similar. So there's a lot of food for thought there for me personally, and I'm sure others around the table, about ramping up the conversations with strategic planners, master planners, local authorities and cities, and gives us an opportunity really to sort of come to the table. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you. That's created for me, and I'm sure lots of others was watching the chat, a great deal of thought and provoked at all things. Do people have any questions? Just show hands and we can kind of.
Yeah, Aaron has. Do you want to come in, Aaron?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Paul, that was a really interesting presentation. So thank you for that. My question was around if we've, if urban regeneration or regeneration generally is being designed for the next generation and designed for the kind of the next cohort of young people, do young people connect with the history of their place, and or at what point do they start to connect with the history of their place?
Okay, that's a good question. So two things on young people for me. Okay, number one, in terms of understanding the history of their place, one of the things that we are endeavouring to do via the Wolsey project here, so I'm not saying the Wolsey project is the right one or the best example, but let's embed that story and make it relevant within the curriculum of every single school in Ipswich. Yeah, so every school does at least one lesson around the stories and the relevance of Wolsey as a person. Yeah, and how did that then lead to the place being the place that it is today, number one. The second thing is we have to find ways of getting young people involved in those initial decision makings, and that is not easy to do. So we all know that the average councillor, do hope I'm not going to upset anybody here, but the average councillor is about 78. And you know, and that politics bit is not the way that young people are going to engage. So we have to find ways of bringing the younger generation in to that decision making right at the start. So we are going to set up in Ipswich a stakeholder group around this 15-minute, we call it the connected town concept, and absolutely front and center is going to be young people will dominate that. Yeah, so we're going to shove out all the oldies, all the 78-year-old councillors who frankly, you know, think that Zara will open in Ipswich a week next Sunday, and we're going to bring young people in to tell us what is it you want this place to be, street by street, building by building, area by area, and that's really important. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Paul. Sorry, I mean, if I can just come back, that was just a follow-up question, if I may. We've seen in recent, I say fairly recent news, that young people can have a negative association with their history. If we take Bristol, for example, and the slave trading, and obviously what's happened there. What happens if, like that situation, some young people these days have a very negative association with the history of place?
Yeah, you know, it's quite a sad thing, isn't it? One of the first things that I did when we came up with the idea of celebrating Wolsey, rather than looking into all of the inspiring bits of his story, and he's quite interesting because he's complex, because you see, for one person he's good and another person he's evil and he's sort of unknown, the rest of it. One of the first things we had to do was check his story for any hidden horrors, and it's so sad that you have to do that, isn't it, really? So that's a Paul Clement view, that's not a corporate view, but you know, in the end you end up doing nothing if you want to appeal to everybody. But yes, I completely agree. But should we not welcome that contested view? Should we not allow, you know, I'm not sure, you know, Bristol got it wrong obviously and ended up with a statue dumped in the water or whatever it was, but we shouldn't be scared of that stuff. It exists, but we've got to bring people in, young people in, so they can help us get the way we tell that story right, even if it's turning our back on it. Doesn't matter, does it? But yeah, it's a bit sad really that I had to check whether, you know, one of the first things I did was Wolsey linked to the slave trade, and then I thought, well, how ridiculous is that? He was hundreds of years before it. But you know, sad that you have to do it really. One of the other things is Charlotte has said, go see Citizen Jane. It is a fantastic, well done Charlotte, it's a fantastic story of how Joan Jacobs came up. And if you're not doing anything, next Thursday, the 26th of May, at 7 o'clock in a cinema near you, is a National Theatre live presentation of a production in London called Straight Line Crazy. So if you see Citizen Jane, that's about Jane Jacobs. If you see Straight Line Crazy, it's about Moses, and Moses and Jane Jacobs were the two that stood against each other in New York. So by the end of next week, you'll know more about it than I do by now. Well done, Charlotte.
Or you're a wealth of knowledge. That's absolutely true. I see people scribbling that down. I can't see any other hands up, but I'll just respond. Trevor's made an interesting point in the chat that our challenge here is to then incorporate physical activity into the design approach. And I think, Trevor, what Paul I think is done is said, here's the process, and where there's an acceptance and there's a process starting around transforming those spaces. And I'm particularly interested in the piece you were talking about Nottingham, Paul, about buildings being left open for open spaces. I think our challenge as active partnerships and other stakeholders is when these processes begin, is almost to be at the table ready with options for how those spaces can be used. So I think there is the bigger regeneration question, but alongside that, certainly for our sector, is let's really start to think about and build up a portfolio of potential options that are local and useful to our places and spaces where we can put physical activity at the centre of what those regeneration themes and potentials might be. But that's probably the subject of another workshop.
Can I just pick up very quickly, because I want to stop your coffee break, on two comments in there about levelling up. I think there are some bits of the levelling up suite of measures that Gove brought in that are frankly bonkers. The first is his idea that if a landlord doesn't let a building for whatever it is, 6 months or something, the local authority take it over and find a tenant. Well, that is just ludicrous. I mean, you know, no landlords keep some space vacant so that they can regenerate it in the future, and you're taking, no town centre wants to be 100% full. Can we be clear on that? Gove's idea that every unit should be full is nonsense. Every town centre needs vacant spaces because it gives you room to move and room to bring in some new people. And then the other idea of decoupling social housing from housing developments and basically giving local authorities an additional grant that then gets built on council housing, that is a route to gentrification. We have been there before. It's the very reason why social housing sits in developments. There's a better way of doing it than Gove's idea, because all you'll end up with is more expensive housing in city centres and council housing as far away as possible on cheap land. That for me is a stupid idea.
Paul, thank you ever so much.
Hopefully there are no Tory councillors in the room.
This is a safe space, and it's a safe and neutral space for people to voice their issues. So just on behalf of everyone, really, can I just thank you for your input. It's absolute genius, and I would be very surprised if we didn't ask you to come back at some point, because it's very thought-provoking, and it's stuff that we really need. Simon, do you think we should go to break now? I would love to carry on this conversation for another hour or so, but I'm just conscious that we have got Calum and Levitt Bernstein here as well. Should we go to break for 5 minutes? Can we do that?
Yeah, that'd be great. And I'm conscious that Susan, you'd asked to speak. If we could push that to the end, that would be really helpful. But thank you for the comments you put in the box. Yeah, so we'll break for 5 minutes, and then Calum, Chris and Ruth will come back and discuss a more local example of regeneration in Thetford, Norfolk. So we'll see you at about 30 minutes past. People, I will just start recording again. As people are starting to come back in, hope you had a chance to run into the other part of the office or the house or wherever you are and grab a drink. So I'd like to introduce Calum initially, who's going to talk about Flagship Housing's work in the Abbey estate in Thetford, and he's joined by Chris Wright and Ruth Richardson from Levitt Bernstein, who will also talk about their contributions in that project. So Calum, welcome.
Great, thanks Simon. Ruth, have you got the slides that are going?
Yeah, give me 2 seconds.
Great. Yeah, so while Ruth's just doing that, I think just to say thank you for having us, really. It's great to be here, great to be part of the conversation. And as Simon said, I think this is going to be a bit more of a local scale, something which we've been working on for the last 4 years now or so. But hopefully it gives a bit of a different insight into regeneration. I can't really add really to what Gemma and Paul have already commented on. I think it's given a really good introduction, and hopefully we're doing this in the right way. Hopefully we've got a bit of a checklist for how we've done this. So yeah, firstly, hello and welcome. Oh, and thank you, really. The presentation today will be split into 3 sections. So I'll give a bit of an introduction into who Flagship Group are, as well as a bit of a history into Thetford as a place. And then Ruth is going to pick up just around some of the work that we've been done and how we've tried to develop the master plan from there. And then Chris is going to focus on some of the meanwhile stories that we're trying to create in the process as well. So if you want to just flick on for us, Ruth, that'd be great. So I guess in terms of who we are, so I work for Flagship Group. We're a housing association with about 31,000 homes across East Anglia. We've got a range of tenure, but predominantly we've got affordable and social housing stock, and the majority of that would have come across in the sort of stock transfer from the 1990s. And if we can just go to the next slide. As we can see here, this is Thetford as a whole. You've got the town centre in yellow. And we actually own quite a lot of homes in Thetford. So we've got about 2,200 homes across the 4 estates. So you can see sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 highlighted there across those estates, all of which were built at a very similar time. So sort of 1960s, 1970s, which means they all come with probably very similar issues in terms of not only the actual homes themselves, but also the layouts that they were built within. But all of them were built part of the sort of town expansion scheme at the time. And I think it's something like Thetford went from around something crazy like 3,000 to nearly 20,000 residents within about 10 years. So a lot of history there to try and circumnavigate. But if we focus on the Abbey, so number 3, the Abbey is our perhaps most deprived housing stock. And I think all of these estates have suffered really with a lack of investment over however many years, mainly in homes, but also in the social infrastructure that surrounds them. And this means that all of them, as well as the Abbey, are some of the most deprived places to live in the country. So the Abbey itself, I think, is in the top 7% most deprived areas. It's our, let's say, most deprived housing area across East Anglia. And I think for us, it's a really pertinent time, really, because if we consider the investment that's going to happen towards the north of the town, so outlined by point number 6, which is the Kingsfleet Sustainable Urban Extension. Without the right investment to the rest of these places, the south of Thetford, really from Kingsfleet downwards, will become left behind. Because of things like right to buy, so especially considering the Abbey here, considering right to buy, it means that our ownership is at around 60% of the estates. We own about 680 properties of the about 1,100 or so. And really, Flagship have had an ambition for 10, 15, 20 years to do something in the estate. And I think really it's around trying to better some of the things Gemma was talking about in terms of the social environment. So the social inequality, the deprivation that's there. And really, we've been on a journey with Levitt Bernstein over the last 4 years or so to try and work out how that looks like by changing elements of the built design. So I just hand over to Ruth, who's going to talk through strategy.
Great, thanks, Calum. So I'm going to start by just really talking about our overall vision for the estates. And you can see here on a diagram the location of the Abbey estate in green at the centre. So that's to the west of the town centre, but also to the east of the A11 and Thetford Forest Park. So it's in quite a prime location within the town. And one of our biggest aspirations really is to think about the reintegration of the Abbey estate back into Thetford. So think about those connections from the town to the estate, to forest, and potentially beyond. And ultimately, you can see how it has quite a strategic role. And so it is kind of a missing piece to the puzzle in terms of looking at the town more holistically and making sure that we don't miss something out at the expense of when we're kind of extending the town and the urban extension is happening in the background. So if we just zoom in to kind of the next level, this is our site strategy for the Abbey estate. It's a diagram that we've been working to for several years now, and ultimately the key principles of which we really want to kind of drill through the master plan layout that I'll show you shortly. So you can see the Little Ouse River to the south, the forest to the west, the town again to the east. And ultimately what we want to do is draw on all of these really rich and valuable assets that surround the Abbey estate and recognise these as kind of opportunities for people that live there and for the town as a whole. So by connecting the Abbey estate better into these, overcoming kind of barriers to movement, we can look at how all of this holistically connects together, as well as providing kind of better recreational opportunities, improvements to homes. But what we're really trying to do is put all of that in the context of the bigger picture for Thetford. The next level of detail, if you like, then is looking at a landscape-led approach for the site itself. So one thing that we're really focusing on is the role of nature and the role of the landscape within the redevelopment that we're considering for the Abbey estate. So primarily you can see that big pink arrow through the centre of the diagram on screen, and that is that key move. How do we connect the Abbey estate back towards the town centre and beyond? And that's actually a historic footpath that's been there for a long length of time. And so what we're trying to do is really integrate that as part of our overarching strategy for the site. You can see the blue arrow that comes through the middle of this diagram. So what we're really hoping to do is use sustainable urban drainage and swales as a key feature of the master plan, but also as a way to kind of improve biodiversity and ecological value. So the whole idea of using the nature-based solutions to really help develop the estate rather than just traditional way of building new homes or something like that. So several new routes and connections are going to be integral to the master plan. You can see the yellow arrow that runs through. So that being the idea of stitching together what is a series of cul-de-sac dead-end streets at the moment. Similarly, a route that would connect from railway through to river. And that's all about realising the riverside as a recreational asset and the opportunities that that might create. So hopefully what we can do is by improving connections, creating new connections, we can really start to knit it all together, improve connectivity and permeability within the estate and beyond. From an open space perspective, the idea being that we can create a series of different types of open spaces. So the possibility of a new public park or neighbourhood park at the centre of the estate, through to shared communal gardens, which are kind of distributed on a more local scale, and then obviously private amenity space to those homes themselves. And so what we're trying to do is offer something for people of all ages and really put health and well-being at the heart of what we're doing, in addition to looking at those kind of social and environmental factors as well.
Great, thanks, Ruth. And I guess, so that's how we've sort of seen it from an urban design perspective, and that's really, I guess, the level of detail we've gone into place. But a massive part, as already mentioned today, around regeneration is moving from place to experience. So if we just go on to the next slide, Ruth. So a huge part of what we've been doing today is just the sheer amount of engagement that we've been doing on the estate. So it started for us back in July 2019, where we just reached out to our tenants in the area. So that's around, let's say, 680 people. And we just asked them a series of questions just about how they feel about living in the area. That was then widened to drop-in sessions, which then invited the whole community again just to pick up on the concerns, but also the positives that are raised. And then from sort of 2021, really, we started just trying to introduce options that would be solutions to some of those issues that people have raised, and we consulted on those between sort of the rest of 2021 onwards. I think there's also a really key part of this that's already been mentioned, to be honest, is how to get young people involved. I think a lot of people within drop-in sessions were of a certain demographic, and it was probably those who had a chance to actually come. So we've also used a digital platform where we've actually seen a huge amount of engagement on the platform called Give My View. And we've also worked with ZCD, who I think Roy mentioned in the comments as well, who've also done some youth engagement with the local school in the area as well. So the engagement, we believe, has been quite robust. We've tried tackling as many stakeholders as possible through different conversations. And hopefully all of that has shaped the options that we've been able to show. So in terms of the estate today, so this is what the estate looks like. I think it suffers probably with common issues associated with the sort of Radburn design layout. You can see that large amount of green space tucked behind these cul-de-sacs coming off of the Spine Road from Canterbury Way. And if we just move on to the next slide, essentially these are some of the key themes that we've heard, which in terms of the positive things we've heard, which is that access to nature. It can't be disputed how green the estate is. And also the access to Little Ridge River. But perhaps there isn't the quality of green space that especially young people need to actually have safe places to play. We also know that there's a massive sense of community. I think that's just because of the time that it was built and also the communities that were formed in a short space of time. There is a huge sense of community within the place. But we also know there are real problems. So especially around antisocial behaviour, especially around fly tipping, we know that the centre of the community is a place where that particularly happens, as well as sort of in garage areas as well as the green spaces. So what we're hoping is that we can use these, which we call symptoms, and they're actually symptoms of a deeper rooted issue because of the built design, as drivers for change in developing the master plan.
Thanks, Calum. So I'm now going to run through how we might turn those kind of issues that Calum has talked about into the opportunities for the master plan. And there's several different concepts that we've applied to the master plan that I'm going to run through in a little bit more detail, and then I'll talk about how they kind of stitch together and create where we are today in terms of the layout and the approach that we're taking. So on the screen at the moment are some photographs of the estate today. So you can see kind of typical garage courts and garage blocks in the two photos at the top. An alleyway, which is very common throughout the estate, kind of poorly lit in between the ends of terraces of some of the existing homes, that's bottom left. And then in a typical existing cul-de-sac street, bottom right, with garages characterising that street and a significant amount of cars and parking, quite ad hoc in places as well. So in terms of those garages, that's one of the key things that we're looking to as an opportunity to potentially remove. They're not necessarily big enough for the modern day car. And what can these spaces actually offer? So if we were to remove blocks of garages, and we can look at opportunities for infill development in these locations and then consider the public realm around them. So potentially turning a garage court into a housing court, some new homes adjacent to existing homes, and the potential for kind of a pocket park or doorstep play areas to the front of those homes. Probably off the picture that you can see on the right, but we would obviously look to incorporate parking within that, but in a better managed, more controlled way. Other instances of the garage blocks, they actually connect along a kind of a pedestrian route, if you like. So what we're looking at is, can we turn and translate this into a new lane? So by removing those garages and potentially looking at some minor selective demolition where appropriate, can we look to have homes that front onto a new safer pedestrian and cycle route that runs through the estate? So that'll both help with people moving around, but also that wider connection issue and trying to kind of stitch together those cul-de-sacs that exist at the moment. This is a photograph of what the neighbourhood centre is at the moment. So you can see shops to the ground floor of the homes. On the right hand side, there's actually a community centre here on the left. Again, we are stood in what is used as a car park, and there are some challenges with levels and access. So what we've looked at is really trying to create a new neighbourhood heart to the estate. So is there an opportunity to maybe relocate that community centre and integrate that into some new buildings that offer new homes, but also provide opportunities for both the existing shops that are there at the moment, but potentially some new residential or community uses. And then you can see in the background of this photograph, there are existing flats in this kind of green space area at the moment, but is there an opportunity to potentially relocate those to the opposite side of the street? And that really opens up kind of green space at the heart of the neighbourhood, which could be what we were talking about, the idea of a community park, which would be a recreational asset for both the Abbey estate, but also for the wider Thetford. This here is a photograph that really just illustrates that lack of permeability that we might have on the estate at the moment. So there is actually a footpath that runs in between these bungalows and the garages. And that footpath is the one that would take you from the shops that we were just looking at in the centre towards the town centre, really. And as you can see, it does look a little bit convoluted. You may not know it's there. And this is a historic footpath. It was originally called Potter's Cross. So we're looking at creating Potter's Path and bringing that into the master plan as that key, that going back to that big arrow that goes from town to forest, and really starting to integrate that into our site strategy and what we're delivering on the ground. So opening this up, making it a wider route, pedestrian, cycle friendly, better lit, the idea of having homes and eyes onto that street. So hopefully it's safer and more active, and so hopefully more useful and more usable. And what Potter's Path will do, and I think this is something that Chris will touch upon shortly, but it will really help us to stitch the Abbey back into its wider surroundings. So whilst it plays a local role within the estate, it also has a more strategic role as well. The final point that I'll just touch on in terms of how the estate looks today is access towards the Little River Ouse. So this is a back green that runs between some of the existing homes, which naturally probably would be the way that you would like to walk to the river. However, some of these spaces are gated off and therefore not publicly accessible. The photograph on the right shows the condition of the backs of the homes that currently back onto the river. So that's the public footpath that would then lead you down towards the river, but maybe it's not possibly the most pleasant footpath upon which to walk. So what we're really hoping to do in the river area is firstly create a new safer route to the river. Again, look at homes that might be able to front onto that route, but also turn that development around and realise the kind of value of the land adjacent to the river and that riverside area, and capitalise on that aspect and what that opportunities that can offer. So ultimately what we've tried to do is take some of these ideas and the different strategies and stitch those together to create options for the Abbey estate. As Calum mentioned, we produced a series of options. There were 4 initially of varying levels of intervention. At Christmas, in the final round of consultation that we did, we presented 2 options to residents, which were the 2 preferable ones at that time. One of them was our first option, which was kind of the lowest level of intervention, which you can see on screen at the moment. And that was predominantly just transforming those garage court areas. So you can see the concept of the lane running through the master plan, and that's where those garage blocks were all stitched together. And then some of the housing courts that you can see upon the periphery. So what we were primarily doing was looking at infill development for this option. Interestingly, the other alternative option that was chosen by residents was that of the highest level of intervention that we showed, which does still retain over half of the existing homes, but uses demolition strategically as to implement kind of more transformational change. So for example, you can see Potter's Path here, arriving in a neighbourhood centre, potentially with the opportunity for some slightly taller buildings, albeit not so tall, and then a park in the centre. And you can see by rationalising the layout, introducing the lane, it instantly promotes movement and connectivity throughout that master plan as a whole. So I'm going to hand over to Chris now, and he's going to talk about some of the spaces that are adjacent to the site itself and the opportunities that they present in addition to those that we have on and within the red line boundary.
Cool. Thanks, Ruth. So in parallel to our work with Flagship on the Abbey estate, we've been working with Greater Thetford Partnership to develop ideas for meanwhile uses alongside the Little Ouse River, which forms part of a strategic link connecting Thetford town centre with the Abbey estate and Thetford Forest beyond to the west. The proposals focus on improving connectivity and accessibility to the river's edge and bringing people into the area to ultimately sort of raise the profile of the Abbey estate in Thetford. So we're moving on to the overarching strategy. This map shows the sites that we've identified alongside the river for improvements, and you can see they form a linear belt landscape between the Abbey estate stretching east to Thetford town and then west towards the forest. And while looking at each of these sites, we've sought to try and link those into existing proposals already present within Thetford to avoid ours sort of being produced in isolation and to build upon improvements that are already underway. So for example, there's the Wayne Hemingway Thetford town strategy, which is a new vision for Thetford as a whole. There's also Thetford Riverside Sculpture and Arts Trail, which is a series of circular walking routes that takes in some of the local artworks. There's the Thetford Loop Cycle Network, which is a waymarked cycle loop, and also Thetford Priory, which is a very important medieval monastery site, which is perhaps a little bit unknown sort of compared to the status that it holds. So we move on to looking at the proposed areas of intervention in a little bit more detail. We have our 8 sites that we identified, and it's a bit more evident at this scale the important role this landscape plays in providing access to nature along this stretch of the Little Ouse for residents of the Abbey estate, but also Thetford town centre and the communities to the south of the river. The 8 sites consist of the Forest Gateway to the west, the riparian buffer, which is an area of riparian vegetation located between the Little Ouse and the Abbey estate. You could kind of see a little bit of that in the visual that Ruth previously showed a few slides back. There's the Abbey estate gateway, the Riverside Park, the meadow, the Abbey Orchard, which is located next to the Priory site, and then finally the town centre gateway. We have also looked a little bit more holistically at some pedestrian and cycle connections alongside the river too. So if we move on, I'm going to sort of look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So our journey from the forest to Thetford begins at the Forest Gateway, and that's currently a footpath underneath the A11 viaduct, and this forms an important gateway between the forest and the pedestrian route towards the centre of Thetford. Currently it suffers from being pretty bleak and uninviting, with the potential for antisocial behaviour. So some of the meanwhile ideas proposed include interventions such as lighting to improve visibility and safety, and perhaps tying in with the Thetford Riverside Sculpture and Arts Trail by highlighting the significance of this space through art installations similar to some of those images. So going on, continuing our journey into town is the riparian buffer, and this site is characterized by its proximity to the Little Ouse and the distinct qualities of the riparian vegetation. You can see in the image on the left hand side its current state. So here we are looking at opportunities for rewilding and potentially trying to restore some of that riparian habitat. And we've also looked at ideas for improving access and use alongside the river edge in a more sensitive manner. So through using footpaths such as raised boardwalks, and also trying to engage local youth groups with perhaps providing natural education spaces. There is the opportunity here to try and link with another initiative called the Brex Fen Edge and Rivers Project to provide some sort of longer term conservation of the riparian habitat in this area. So as we continue along the river, we then reach the Abbey Gateway, and this is another pedestrian connection beneath Canterbury Way Viaduct that leads into the Abbey estate. And this forms a key gateway into the estate and also an initial sort of point of contact with the river itself for that community. So the proposals here could again tie in with the Thetford Sculpture and Arts Trail, and we could achieve sort of an uplift in quality through perhaps temporary community pop-up initiatives, or perhaps more permanent installations, such as some of those kind of murals or lighting that you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the page. So a consistent theme as well throughout all of these meanwhile interventions has been about the importance of riverside connectivity, and improving access and activity along the Little Ouse are the key objectives. So we aim to achieve these through perhaps the creation of more formalized and inviting pathways for both pedestrians and cyclists, so that they can explore and interact with the water's edge more widely. And even some simple ideas such as the provision of seating will help to promote longer stays, and a wayfinding strategy might help to sort of formalize some of these routes and draw people into the area from wider afield. So site number 5 is the Riverside Park, and this is an area that coincides with the siting of an old fort, or the previous siting of an old fort, and is also located close to a local primary school. And the site serves as a linking space between the estate and the river's edge. So ideas for this area really built upon its strategic location, trying to propose more active uses that perhaps reference the site's heritage. So for example, the uses can include the creation of a thematic play space, which is inspired by the old fort, or even we could look at hire for bikes and kayaks, that this space acts as a base for exploration further afield and into Thetford Forest. So The meadow was the next space on the way into Thetford, and this is an area, as you can see in the left-hand side image, that is characterized by open meadows and has much more sort of naturalistic qualities than some of the other sites. So here we've really sought to conserve and enhance that natural quality by protecting the existing habitat and adopting a more ecologically led design approach. So some of the examples of interventions here could include more sensitive walking routes in the bottom right-hand corner, so sort of more temporal as opposed to permanent footpaths, and biodiversity enhancing features as well. As we approach Thetford, this is where we pass the Abbey Orchard site next to the historically significant Thetford Priory. And the Abbey Orchards we're proposing, well, they're sort of located in quite a strategically important location adjacent to the Priory, but also directly between Thetford Town Centre and the Abbey Estate. And so this site, it also falls along the Potter's Path proposals that Ruth talked about earlier, which will be the primary pedestrian link into the town centre from the Abbey Estate. So the ideas for the Abbey Orchard focus on promoting the Priory as a significant historic destination, whilst also encouraging people from the surrounding neighbourhood into the area. So here, initiatives sort of include community orchards and growing gardens that sort of reference that historic land use adjacent to the Priory site, and provide opportunities for the communities to come together around one of Thetford's most valuable heritage assets. And there might also be opportunities here to link with English heritage to improve awareness of the Priory more widely, and perhaps make the area more of a regional visitor destination. And then this is a more developed kind of view of Potter's Path at the minute that we've been working with Flagship on, and our aspirations are really about this pedestrian and cycle network that stitches the Abbey Estate into the town centre, and the Priory and the Abbey Orchards form a key sort of destination along this route as well. And then finally, just to finish on our sort of meanwhile interventions, the journey into Thetford kind of culminates in this town centre gateway. And as you can see from the image in the left, it consists of a subway under quite a busy road that forms quite an imposing barrier between Thetford, the Little Ouse and the Abbey Estate. So while the scale of the interventions won't fully be able to resolve the disconnect that creates, we're looking at how lighting, again, and art interventions can really play an important role in the feeling of safety and the sense of arrival as you approach Thetford. And also perhaps the art interventions could promote wider arts trails and the local heritage, so that visitors to the town are informed more obviously about what's happening alongside the Little Ouse and in the Abbey Estate and beyond. So that's a summary of all of our sort of meanwhile proposals, and I'm just going to hand back to Calum, who is going to talk about the next steps, really.
Yeah, thanks both. As you can see, a lot of stuff going on and quite hard to compact into yeah, the amount of time, but so sorry if we've gone over a little, but yeah, in terms of next steps, so firstly, just on the actual Abbey Estate regeneration, we're in the process of developing the preferred option. We're hoping to show that option to the community within the next month or so, and then the idea being that we sort of further engage to develop detail before we go to a public exhibition in the autumn. And in terms of the meanwhile uses, we, as mentioned, we're partnering with the Greater Thetford Partnership as well as local authorities, just to see what funding exists. I think a lot of that sort of stuff will rely on probably individual funding elements, and I think taking Gemma's point about the iterative nature of a lot of this, it probably won't all happen at once. It'll probably be focused on many ideas that sort of amalgamate into something wider. So yeah, that's where we are. Thank you for your time and listening to us.
That's fantastic, Calum. Thank you very much, and thank you, Ruth and Chris. Some incredible work going on. I think it's a credit to the level of engagement that you've ended up with what was the most significant amount of regeneration, that being the preferred option. So it's incredible that that's the direction of travel of the work. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and I noticed a few coming through. Susan, you had a few points about food and edible neighbourhoods. Is there anything you want to come in with a question?
It's been a brilliant morning, and there's been so many fantastic things. I hope no one minds my huge numbers of comments in the chat. It's just triggered lots of ideas and thoughts. I'd love to think that for this one, that the meanwhile uses related to food would have their own kind of logic, you know, that I can see why they could do other things as well. And that's brilliant. And food's often used in that way to kind of help other things happen. But I mean, you know, often you do find in, you know, as you would know, a lot of inequality. I did a food retrofitting project in Hatfield, you know, and it was in part looking at estates, and there was a lot of structural inequality and food poverty, food deserts, food swamps. These are all things that are happening. So people having access to orchards and to other kind of food growing opportunities, you know, are really important, you know, just in relation to food. So it'd be great to think, and I'd love to hear back from the team about their thoughts about how that could be sort of integrated, sort of those food aspects could be integrated permanently. And actually going back to both Gemma's and Paul's presentations, we could see food was really important in those as well. And for me, I guess I see it as a really key part of any kind of regeneration and sort of retrofitting, sprawl repair, kind of, you know, any of these kinds of activities.
Excellent.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that's something we've sort of weaved into the meanwhile proposals, trying to reference some of the historical uses, but even within the wider regeneration of the Abbey estate, we're looking at how food growing can be incorporated within the smaller communal greens that have a bit of ownership on a sort of neighbourhood scale, or even sort of block by block scale, that the residents can use to grow their own foods.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Redburn layouts, you've got a huge amount of, you know, spatial scope to play with there, don't you? And of course, that was true. I mean, in the way that Barry Parker organised the master planning in Letchworth, you know, organised a lot of really interesting kind of food-related land uses, not just in private gardens, but quite subtly in relation to very localised areas. I think, you know, we've got quite a few interesting plan and settlement models in the 20th century that give us lots of scope there. So it's just brilliant to see that you guys focusing on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Steve Densley.
Simon, it's just relating back to the importance of engagement. I know Paul and Gemma picked up on it in their presentations as well. I did some work with Public Health Scotland around public engagement around the Glasgow Green area, and it's incredibly difficult to do effectively. The risk is that you'll get a cohort of about 20% of the community with the loudest voices that will give their opinion that doesn't necessarily reflect the opinion of the masses. Calum mentioned as sort of a social landlord having a cohort of 680 households, I think. I'd be interested to know what response rate was from that, and if they think there are any lessons to be learned or gaps that could be filled to sort of better engage with the community. And following on from that, what plans are there in place once the interventions are complete? Because again, some learnings from Glasgow were that programming was massively important. It's one thing to build all these connected communities and the meanwhile stuff that Chris was talking about, but unless you actually engage with the community that you intend to actually use these, they're going to be used potentially by different cohorts or not used at all. So really it's just what thoughts have gone into what happens once the interventions have taken place to make sure that they're actually used effectively.
Shall I come in straight away, Simon? Great. Yeah, I guess, yeah, thanks for that, Steve. I guess in terms of the engagement piece, I think you're right. We realised that actually we probably were just targeting one community, especially with drop-in sessions probably held at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, being brutally honest. And I think that's why we moved to digital. And I think picking up on Paul's point, and just that photo of people just sit, or young people, if I can call them that, sitting there sort of on their phones. So what we did was we've used Built ID, who actually geo-target areas, so they can draw a line around the Abbey estate and then use targeted ads on things like Facebook, on things like Instagram, to then try and put the surveys and the engagement into people's hands, and then they do it for a really interactive way. And I think across the sort of consultation itself, through the written surveys we were doing, I think in each step we averaged about 50 responses, so minuscule in comparison, really. And then in on the digital, we were averaging about 550 responses. So a huge amount of engagement's gone into this, and I think, you know, it's not necessarily cheap, but it does definitely do the job. And I think hopefully we've given as many people an opportunity as possible. I think there are gaps. I think, being brutally honest, we could probably do more with older sort of young people, as it were. So definitely sort of like secondary school age, we've got quite a lot of insight from younger kids, and also, and I hate to use the term, but harder to reach. I think harder to reach people are harder to reach because they're harder to reach. So I think you're going to struggle at any point, but what we have done as much as we can is give opportunity. So whether that's things translated, whether that's trying to organise private sessions and use different community stakeholders. We've done not necessarily all we can, but we've tried as hard as we can, really. And also, to pick up on your point, Steve, around the future, I think Flagship are just one player in this. Obviously, we've got a huge amount of ownership within the area. We've got obviously 60% of homes, but what we've made sure is that it isn't Flagship just rushing in almost as white knight syndrome, because, you know, we could do this and it could be 15 years later, and then we could, you know, if we move away, I think that's how gentrification will happen. But I think what essentially we've tried to do is build up community stakeholders. We've got community partners, which consists of the local school, local church, the local charities, because they're the people who are on the ground today and will continue to be on the ground, hopefully, for the next however many years as well. So building up as much, I guess, stakeholder influence with them, so that we try and put the power back in their hands for the long term. I think that's also the case with, we've got a frontline partnership conversation that happens as well, which is us, Norfolk County and Breckling district, essentially to do the same. So anyone who works in frontline can come and join this conversation to ensure that we're essentially transferring knowledge as it goes along. So, but it's definitely something to think about, and I think hopefully our plans as they continue will involve that sort of end user element as well.
That's brilliant, thank you. On the digital side, were you able to capture any demographics information around social inequalities, long-term health conditions, social isolation, that sort of thing? Because these are the things that physical activity can tackle head on.
Sure. We haven't, being brutally honest. I think it was more just your generic demographics but I think what we are doing is we're working with an organisation called Stantec to try and create basically a social value metric, as it were. So the idea being that at the beginning of the regeneration, which we are after 4 years, we can almost create a social value framework, which will then tell us what the social value is. It's similar to a health impact assessment, probably hopefully more than that, of the estate, and then what the change will be. And hopefully we can pick up a lot of that sort of stuff ongoing throughout phase of regeneration over the next 15 years. Brilliant. Within that metric. So.
Thanks. Yeah, Paul, over to you.
Right, so here we go. Another controversial point from the Ipswich department. I'm interested actually in the discussion, Calum, you're having around how you engage people in a process. I think we need to remember we start from a point where we have processes already in play in this country, primarily through government interventions, local authority interventions, which are appalling in terms of consultation. So what tends to happen, take a place, doesn't matter where it is a group of people who are the same group of people that you always see in every meeting about anything to do with that place, get together and decide their overall strategy. And then what they do is they break it down into a series of deliverables, and they apply for external funding, be it from their local authority, their county, or the government. And the government love it because they love funding shovel-ready projects. We all heard that, shovel-ready. That isn't how you do vision. But anyway, shovel-ready projects. And then what we do is we take that individual project and we go out to consultation, and we ask anybody to come back and tell us what they think of that. And Calum, your point is right. That is an invitation to all the naysayers to arrive by number, and anybody that is, I don't really care whether you do it or not, or actually, yeah, I rather like the idea, there is no route for them to respond. Because what we don't do is we don't say how that piece fits in an overall jigsaw. So what we did in Ipswich, which follows Calum but is nowhere near as refined as Calum's example, was we started off from saying, let's get a stakeholder group that is enough people that is representative of our broader community. We got to a figure of 2,500. And let's break that group down so that when we come back, it represents the 135,000 people in Ipswich, X number of young people, Y number of old people. We then worked out how we went to those people. So for people of my age, we go and sit and have a cup of tea with them. For young people, we did it entirely digitally. We met with church groups, we met with school groups, we met with business groups or whatever. We came back, the 2,500 people that statistically was representative, and we allowed them to build the vision with us, not to tell us whether an individual part worked, but what's that overall vision. So here is where it all goes wrong. The first part was to close a slip road and to take some traffic out of the town centre. We love that idea, don't we? What do the local authority do? Consult on that bit and don't explain the whole. 800 responses, 720 against, 84 closing the road. I rest my case.
Yeah, I think just to, if I can comment on that, Paul, I think you're right there, and again, I hate to use this sort of phrase, but it truly is about taking people on the journey, isn't it? So if in everything that we've done, we've ensured that everyone has the same information in their hands, whether they're a resident, a landlord, a homeowner, or our tenants. And so we do it by sort of brochures, and we always explain what's happened before, and we always explain the decision making that people are going to make for now. I think the real difficulty we truly have with that is because of the nature of the place, which is, as mentioned, fairly deprived. It means that we can often overspeak, so we have to try and plain English it as much as possible, using lots of pictures and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, I've been working on this for 4 years now. I'm very much in it. I almost have to take a step back every so often and go, the people living on the estate just want to live on the estate. So that's what we had to do, especially during COVID times, was take a step back and say, what is it that people actually need? And at that point, it probably wasn't conversations about the future. So yeah, so I think that's probably one point. I think also to comment as well, Paul, I think for us, the start was probably not necessarily around the vision, but it was what matters to you. So it was probably a different starting place of just tell us what the problems are, tell us what works, tell us what doesn't work, and we'll build a picture from there. And Levitt Bernstein is so good at this sort of stuff of working out on an iterative basis of, actually, you've told us there's fly tipping, but perhaps that's because there's lack of ownership in a space. So if we just drew some homes, just massing exercise for now, if we drew some homes here, maybe that'll create some more ownership, and maybe fly tipping won't happen because you actually want to be in a place rather than it being a big bit of just green space. So it's almost a different starting point because it isn't a vision for a massive locality, but it is almost that neighbourhood thought.
But Calum, the principle in a sense though is the same.
Yeah, I get that.
And I think what we did as well is, you're being honest with people up front and saying you're here at the start, you've got a chance to influence this, but you do need to accept that on some aspects of this, whatever it is, you will be up on the deal, and on other aspects, to be honest, you'll be down on the deal. But we've got to agree somehow we get to a point where it's overall right for the place and right for its future, and that's awkward. And sometimes what we tend to do is go out and consult, saying it's wonderful, isn't it? Just tell us how wonderful it is. Or we present it with no narrative around it whatsoever, which encourages all the naysayers. You've got to be honest in the middle there and say there's some good bits, there's some bad bits, there's some bits that are hard, there's some bits that people will win from, but we're going to go on this journey together. I couldn't agree with you more.
This is a discussion and a debate that I think I said at the beginning we could spend all day, and it's fascinating. But both, Paul, Calum, you're right. The important bit is the starting element, isn't it? And it's making sure that we have a vision and an approach, and that's bringing it back to this. I guess is potential for active partnerships to play the part of that role, and bringing some of this stuff, connecting up the silo to some degree, and some of those things. But Yeah, I'm gonna. That's absolutely fascinating. So, just on, is there any more questions? Sorry, before we. I know we're just running slightly short of time, but I don't want to stimulate the. I don't want to stifle the conversation. I can't see any more questions. Simon, I don't know if you can see any others.
No, I don't think so.
I guess just on behalf of everyone, can I just thank Calum, Paul, Ruth, and Chris. It's been fascinating this morning, and we've had it from both a strategic framework and a detailed perspective. If anything, I think what it does is bring to light some of the questions we can potentially ask as active partnerships, but as other stakeholders. So I really hope you found this useful, just in terms of sharing and continuing to think and drive the agenda. Purpose of this community of practice is to build more momentum around the importance of how we design, develop our built environment. And as Paul said, it's not a short-term thing, this is a long-term thing, so we need to build on it piece by piece. So can I just thank the presenters, absolutely spot on. I'm really grateful for you giving up your time and bringing everybody together. We did have a little session towards the end, or section of the agenda towards the end of this, for sort of updates. I'm just going to open it up to the floor, if that's okay. If people have got specific things that they want to update. I saw a few hands go up then, and a few hands come down, so feel free to put your hands up.
I think they might have been claps.
I need new glasses, clearly. Yeah, so they were, thanks guys, that's really good. Has anybody got anything in terms of national updates that they would want to offer, things that they've come across that they think might be useful to share? I can't see any hands. I'll just kick off briefly. I did put it in the chat, but back to our levelling up discussion. For those that may be not connected with their local authorities, the government announced allocations for the UK Share Prosperity Fund to districts and cities and county councils, I think a couple of weeks ago. So if you want to connect with that, it's probably worth a conversation with your local authority. Districts are getting in the region of between 1.5 up to sort of 4 or 5 million for UK Share Prosperity Fund, which is the first bit of levelling up. And I've got a meeting this afternoon with all of our chief leisure cultural services officers about how we connect into that. So yeah, just an update. Levelling up gender is moving on, but the UK Share Prosperity Fund is live. I think applications have got to be in by July, so it's a fairly short time around to turn around. But there are opportunities for our sector to be able to, both revenue and capital, to be contributing to that. So there's just one thing to note. Any others in terms of national updates? No, we occasionally get Nick Evans, head of planning from Sport England, to give us an update on the sort of uniting the movement and the active environments core theme within that, but we'll perhaps move that to next time, because I know things internally are moving at pace. So we'll park that one for next one. Okay, so where do we go next? We've got I think some of you've got a slide you want to share in terms of the next series of workshops and connect sessions.
Yeah, just to give everyone, I'll share this slide with the summary that goes out, but it's just really to show the events that we have remaining this year, and we put some, we've finalized some dates and times for the following sessions. So we do have in the June, July, we have 1 hour network sessions where people have a chance to just dial in informally. We run a couple of breakouts within those. I think people have generally found them very productive and useful so far. So please come along to those. The more of you that attend, the more useful they tend to be. We've given everyone a break in August. I hope everyone's happy with that. And we aim to convene a community of practice again on the 7th of September. So we'd welcome ideas, themes, topics that you would like to cover. The steering group will have a look at those with you or on your behalf. And I'm put together something in June or July and get out to you with the suggested agenda. But your ideas and input into those events is clearly fundamental to their success, and there's the agenda for the rest of the session, the rest of the year. So I'll share this slide with you all. Please, if you've got any reflections on today that you'd like to add to the Padlet, and that will stay live for a little bit longer. So I'll please encourage you to continue adding to that for the rest of today at least, and then we'll send out a little bit of a summary of some of that information as well as a wrap up for this session. So thank you to all today's speakers, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thank you all.